Morning, everyone. Well, getting beautiful outside, huh? Nice, crisp mornings. Yeah. Today we're going to move into episode 4 and find out a little about George Whitefield and how important Boston was in settling our country. So. Does everyone have a sheet to follow along with? And I guess without further ado, we'll jump into this.
Today on Drive Through History, you're going to drive and walk with me through some of the most important historical locations in Boston and Newburyport, Massachusetts. We will walk the famous Freedom Trail that cuts through downtown Boston, but we will start this episode not in America, but on a train just outside of Gloucester, England, where I visited the birthplace of one of the most famous and influential men of colonial America. Prior to the American Revolution, America began to develop its spiritual independence from a more traditional European view of Christianity. And there appeared in the width and breadth of the colonies an enormous surge of a new kind of religious expression. It was called the Great Awakening. We're on our way to the city of Gloucester here in England to look at the hometown of the father of that movement, a passionate, itinerant English preacher named George Whitefield. George Whitefield was born right here at the Bell Inn, here in Gloucester, England, December 16th, 1714. George grew up here, a boisterous and theatrical kid with a love of acting and theater, a talent that would later serve him well in his ministry because he liked to act out Bible stories in his sermons. When George Whitefield was 12 years old, he was sent to grammar school in that building here at St. Mary's of the Crypt. He had a record of truancy and ended up dropping out at age 15 to help his mother working over in the inn. It was during those years where he would sit up late at night reading the Bible that a desire to preach was birthed inside of him. Well, we're here. This is the church that George Whitefield got his start in, St. Mary's of the Crypt. You guys are hearing that too, right? It's weird. After graduating from Oxford, the Bishop of Gloucester ordained George Whitefield to the Anglican Church, despite the fact that he was well below the canonical age, the age you were expected to reach before you were considered mature enough for formal ministry. Immediately, George Whitefield leapt into his chosen profession, preaching his very first sermon right here from this very pulpit. It was obvious that young George Whitefield had a special gift, and this unassuming young man from a small town in England was about to leap onto the world stage. Over the next several decades, Whitefield would travel to America 7 times, making a total of 13 transatlantic voyages. Now keep in mind, this was back in a day when making such a voyage was a long and perilous adventure. Whitefield had a knack for connecting with almost any audience, and he was tenacious in his pursuit of souls, sometimes preaching open-air sermons in front of churches that refused to admit him. Burly men would weep like babies when he preached. Ladies would swoon in religious ecstasy, and sometimes people would even convulse on the ground.
The First Great Awakening is a name given to the period of time when new Christian movements were highly active in the American colonies. Whitefield helped light a fire that became a revival, sweeping across the American colonies. This new personal expression of faith was a powerful change, and it further distanced many of the American people from the Anglican Church, the official state church of England. With faith becoming separated from government in the minds of a large number of Americans, the seeds of independence would be sown from American church pulpits for the next 30 to 40 years. George Whitefield spent most of his adult life in America and preached over 18,000 formal sermons. In the process of faithfully sharing the gospel of Jesus Christ to Americans, Whitefield became a beloved figure and was buried where he had ministered to so many.
I'm here at the Old South First Presbyterian Church, right here in beautiful Newburyport, Massachusetts. Whitefield's funeral was held here October 2nd, 1770, at the Old South First Presbyterian Church. It was so well attended that thousands of people couldn't even reach the doors. In fact, memorial services were held for him all over the nation. And it's beneath the pulpit of this church that Whitefield's remains are buried. Now, you can still come here to pay your respects to George Whitefield, but this site has been a site of pilgrimage for many years, well, ever since he died. In fact, people would sometimes take little bits of clothing and even bones from his body. In fact, in modern times, church officials have been working to bring all those pieces back together. Actually, they're still missing a piece, a thumb bone. Now, inside of this crypt lie the remains of George Whitefield. It's an actual cast of his skull. He's buried in here with the very first pastor of this church, along with a close ministerial colleague. The impact of the life and death of George Whitefield on colonial America often goes unmentioned in modern history books. But one famous preacher who followed said this: "Often as I have read his life," wrote C.H. Spurgeon, "I am conscious of a distinct quickening whenever I turn to it. He lived. Other men seem to be only half alive. But Whitefield was all life, fire, wing, force. My own model, if I may have such a thing, under the due subordination of my Lord, is George Whitefield. But with unequal footsteps must I follow in his glorious path."
Next, it was time to leave Newburyport, cruise south to Boston, park the Jeep, and put on my walking shoes. If you go to Boston, no doubt you'll want to visit the Freedom Trail. The Freedom Trail is a pathway that links some of the most frequently visited historic sites in Beantown. Notice I said most. There are some amazing places in the region that are not on the Freedom Trail, simply because they were not within close walking distance. I hope you've got some comfortable walking shoes, because we're going to hit all the sites on Boston's Freedom Trail, on drive, or should I say walk, through history. Boston Common is the first stop on the Freedom Trail. You may want to pick up a guidebook here.
You ever follow one of those lines at a hospital that guides you along a path and takes you to your final destination without a lot of complicated directions? Well, that's the idea behind the Freedom Trail, originating right here in Boston Commons. Only with the Freedom Trail, it's a red brick pathway. The important part, of course, is to remember, always stay on the path. Yeah, I know. I just was checking the trees. This 50-acre oasis is America's oldest public park, dating all the way back to 1654. It was originally used as grazing land for cattle owned by Boston farmers, and later for gatherings, such as public executions. Mary Dyer, a Quaker, was hanged here in 1660. The Massachusetts Bay Colony had a law banning Quakers who defied the law. Mary Dyer is considered to be the only woman in the history of the United States to ever die for religious freedom. The British Army camped out right here just before the start of the Revolutionary War. From here, they departed to Lexington and Concord for what would be the first hostilities of the War for Independence.
It's hard to miss the gleaming gold dome of the State House as you exit Boston Common. Boston is the capital of Massachusetts, and the State House is the second stop on the Freedom Trail. The Massachusetts State House is an architectural masterpiece designed by Charles Bulfinch and completed in 1798. Charles Bulfinch was a fine early American architect and regarded by many as the first native-born American to practice architecture as a profession. He also designed the original rotunda and dome of the U.S. Capitol.
Charles Bulfinch's works are a study in simplicity, balance, and good taste. And he started the federal style that became so popular in the 19th century. He studied at the Boston Latin School and Harvard. After graduation, he went on a grand tour of Europe. It was there that Thomas Jefferson became something of a mentor to him.
Following the red line downhill from the State House, you can't miss the 217-foot steeple of Park Street Church.
The church, active to this day with a thriving congregation, was built back in 1809. The Park Street Church has a long and proud tradition of evangelical doctrine, missions, and the application of Scripture to social issues. In fact, important anti-slavery speeches were delivered right here during its early history.
Right next door to Park Street Church is Granary Burial Ground. There's something about old cemeteries that I really like. It just fires up my imagination.
Founded way back in 1660, the Granary Burial Ground on Tremont Street in Boston is the city's third oldest cemetery, serving as the final resting place to many of America's most loved and admired patriots of the Revolution, including 3 signers of the Declaration of Independence: John Hancock, Robert Treat Paine, and Samuel Adams. The victims of the Boston Massacre are also buried here. And don't miss this simple memorial to the revolutionary hero, Paul Revere. Just another example of the many humble and simple stone markers that commemorate the lives and deaths of so many of our country's finest men and greatest heroes. When you come here, make sure you leave enough time to really stop and consider the legacy that these men have left us.
Further down the path is King's Chapel, a 1754 church designed by Peter Harrison and known for its Georgian interior. A Unitarian church today, it is open daily in the summer. Look for a statue of Benjamin Franklin welcoming you to the next stop on the Freedom Trail. Boston Latin School opened in 1635 and was the nation's first public school. While the Boston Latin School is still in existence, it is no longer at this site. Today, it's a restaurant. Hungry yet? You soon will be. Boston's Old Corner Bookstore is one of the oldest structures in the entire city of Boston, having been erected in 1712 by Thomas Creese.
Now, this building was typical of the kinds of dwellings and shops that lined the streets of Boston during colonial days. Note the distinctive gambrel roof. Now, a gambrel roof is a symmetrical two-sloped roof, which gave the benefit of a sloped roof with additional headspace on the top level. Now, the word comes from the medieval Latin word gamba, which means hoof or leg of an animal. No doubt you've seen many barns with roofs like this in your day. Fortunately, this building was preserved and restored in 1970.
In the mid-1800s, a publishing house owned this building, and it was something of a hangout for literary giants like Charles Dickens, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, and Henry David Thoreau. You've got to check it out.
Completed in 1729, the Old South Meeting House was the largest building in colonial Boston, which made it a natural gathering place for the colonists as they grew increasingly weary of English rule. It gained fame as the organizing point for the Boston Tea Party on December 16, 1773, when 5,000 colonists gathered right here. Famous congregation members included Samuel Adams, Ben Franklin, and William Dawes, who accompanied Paul Revere on his famous midnight ride.
As our tour continues, we visit Boston's Old State House. Now, this building served as the first headquarters for the British government in Boston. Built in 1713, it is the oldest surviving public building in Boston and the seat of the first elected legislature in the New World. In 1761, James Otis argued against the writs of assistance in the Royal Council chamber. A writ of assistance was kind of a search warrant on steroids, and the colonists hated them because the power was frequently abused. Though losing the case, Otis's speech was one of the events which led to the American Revolution. The Fourth Amendment of our Constitution outlaws writs of assistance.
After the American Revolution, this building served as the seat of Massachusetts Commonwealth government from 1830 to 1841. This beautiful building is an architectural treasure and a study unto itself. The lion and unicorn are a symbol of the royal coat of arms and used to remind the colonists of the royalty and supremacy of the king. Today, they're reminders that we no longer have a king because we told him to take a hike. Right in front of the Old State House is a cobblestone circle right here on this traffic island in front of the east side of the Old State House. This rather unceremonious traffic island marks the spot where the British killed 5 colonists on March 5th, 1770, in an event that later became known as the Boston Massacre.
An engraving of the event was drawn by Paul Revere and printed in newspapers and pamphlets. This incident helped spark the revolution. Faneuil Hall, aka Faneuil Hall, is located adjacent to the Faneuil Hall Marketplace, also known as Quincy Market.
This really is a beautiful building. It was built in 1742 by a Boston merchant by the name of Peter Faneuil and later remodeled by Charles Bulfinch, who we looked at earlier. It was the site of many famous and passionate anti-British protests, including speeches made by Samuel Adams and James Otis and others who were encouraging an independence from Great Britain. Today it's part of the Boston National Historical Park and is sometimes known as the Cradle of Liberty.
Faneuil Hall is a premier example of Georgian architecture. Georgian describes architectural styles built between 1720 and 1840 and named after 4 British kings named, you guessed it, George. Georgian architecture is characterized by its beautiful proportion and balance. Here we see simple mathematical ratios that were used to determine the height of a window in relation to its width. This style was widespread in the English colonies of the time. An Americanized version of this style later became known as the Federal building style.
During the Revolutionary War, a secret password was often required of many colonial soldiers. When asked the question, "What sits atop Faneuil Hall?" the reply better be, "Why, a grasshopper." Of course.
Quincy Market is a great place to stop for a refreshment break during your 2.5-mile walk along the Freedom Trail. The indoor-outdoor market is home to dozens of restaurants and food vendors. The next stop on the Freedom Trail is the home of the famous midnight rider Paul Revere. Here, American patriot and silversmith Paul Revere lived from 1770 to 1800.
The house was originally built in 1680, and at over 325 years old, it's the oldest surviving building in downtown Boston. Now, if you come here, prepare for some time travel You can walk where Paul Revere walked and touch what he touched. It's really a cool place. It'll really fire your imagination. I mean, how many of our houses are going to be around in 2335? This is the Old North Church, dating back to 1723. In its day, it was the tallest building in the entire city of Boston, making it the perfect signal tower. And while it was technically the King's Church, it was here that Robert Newman lit 2 lanterns to alert Paul Revere and others that the British were arriving by sea. And the rest, as they say, it's history. History. The rest, as they say, it's history.
As we continue our virtual tour of the Freedom Trail in Boston, we look back at the tower of the Old North Church and imagine Paul Revere urgently looking up to see that church steeple. A visit to Boston really brings the history you learned in school to life. The Freedom Trail continues to wind its way through the north end of Boston. The next stop is Copp's Hill Burial Ground, a cemetery located high above the city on a hill that was used as a vantage point by the British during the Battle of Bunker Hill. Many local merchants and artisans are buried here.
In fact, Robert Newman, who lit the 2 lanterns on top of the Old North Church, is also buried here, along with many local merchants and artisans from early Boston. And another important detail is the fact that it's said that some British soldiers actually used some of these tombstones for target practice. Scoundrels.
The Freedom Trail leads right here, the USS Constitution.
The USS Constitution is a wooden-hulled, 3-masted Navy frigate built here in Boston by an order signed by George Washington himself. It was launched in 1797 and is today the oldest commissioned warship that's still afloat. Now, it was nicknamed Old Ironsides back in the War of 1812 because of the British cannonballs that seemed to harmlessly bounce off the southern live oak sides. Now, free guided tours are offered daily, so you want to get here early because lines form. Because this boat with such an illustrious history is recognized now as a true national treasure. Corpsman, medic, owie. There are 56 guns on this ship. Now imagine the noise and chaos in this room alone during the heat of battle. Here's some authentic cannonballs. This way might be better. Why do I want to say things like, "Arr, Captain Jack Sparrow"? We're down below in the USS Constitution, and this is the captain's quarters, where he slept. And this was his own personal bathroom. Talk about a room with a view. Check it out. Woo! That's strange. A lint box. I wonder how many belly buttons that came out of. Actually, I'm gonna make a contribution. There we go.
A 221-foot granite obelisk marks the site of the first formal battle of the American Revolution, the Battle of Bunker Hill. This battle was technically in the W column for the British, because they took the hill. But the victory came at a terrible cost. Over 1,000 British soldiers were lost. It was right here that the British learned that they weren't exactly fighting a bunch of peasants with pitchforks. The British hold on Boston was short-lived after the arrival of
George Washington. And this monument behind me, erected back in 1843, commemorates the Battle of Bunker Hill. And if you're in the mood for some pretty sweet views of Boston, climb the tower steps if you have any energy left, because this is the final stop on Boston's Freedom Trail.
Well, that's it for the Boston Freedom Trail. You've got to see it for yourself. When in Boston, you might want to check out Dorchester Heights, the location of America's first major victory against the British. It was a long day of hoofing it around. My plans for the next day included Lexington and Concord, so I decided to set up camp at a Minuteman campground. With the adventure trailer and a little help from my friends, I knew I'd soon be ready for a home-cooked meal over an open fire. It was time to kick back and enjoy the good life. One of the many benefits of being your humble host.
And there's nothing like that old-time American campfire classic, pizza. Few people realize you can give day-old pizza a second chance by reheating it over an open wood fire. And a little fresh cheese. Keep that nice and warm, just like Mom used to make. Needs more cheese. More cheese. This one's got the cheese built right in. Or does it need more? More cheese. And no campfire is complete without roasted marshmallows. They were out of the big ones. Ow! Ow! Get out of my way. Anybody got any hand sanitizer? Totally smells like gunpowder down here. Hope this thing doesn't spring a leak.
That guy's quite a character. This is part of the Drive Through History series, and if you're interested in, if you missed an episode or whatever, we have this on the Right Now Media. If you have your Right Now Media at home, which you can get through the church, it's at no cost. But yeah, it's on there. In fact, we're taking it off of there now. But so if you missed one last week's, or you're going to miss one in the future, just get on Right Now Media, and you can log into these pretty easy. So it's kind of neat. I found just kind of going through that, the architecture. It's hard to imagine that back in the 1700s, 1800s, that they could build the buildings and do the things that they did. You think of the limited amount of construction equipment they had. It was pretty amazing. But just curious, has anybody been to the Freedom Trail? They talk about the Freedom Trail on here. Has anyone been there at all? Sounds kind of interesting. But okay, our discussion questions for today. How did the First Great Awakening change the mindset of the colonists and set the stage for the American Revolution? Anyone have anything they'd like to share on that? Yes, Judy.
I had written down that seeds of independence were sown by the Great Awakening, in the mindset of the colonists, and also it started their break from the Anglican Church.
Yeah, great. Exactly. It was the break from the Anglican Church, and yeah. Anyone have anything else? That was mainly it, but great. Who is George Whitefield, and what role did he play in the First Great Awakening? Anybody have anything on George? Anybody remember how many sermons did he preach in his lifetime? 18,000. Yeah. Pretty amazing. It said he spread the Christian faith with a bold and personal form of evangelism. So he had started his preaching in England and then ended up migrating to the United States and ended up at the church that they were showing here, the South Church. So.
Dave, I had one thing that struck me.
Yes.
When he was a young lad, he was studying. He said that he was reading his Bible. Apparently, he read it quite a bit because that's when he would start getting these thoughts that he wanted to be a preacher and take the Word of God. And to think all the trips that he made across the Atlantic, coming to America. But that's the part that struck me is when he was reading his Bible. That's when he started having his thoughts inside that he wanted to preach God's Word. So.
Yeah, very good. Thank you, Dennis. Yeah, that's amazing that they said that he went back and forth from England to the United States 13 times. And you think of how many people died on those trips, you know, when you study the Pilgrims. Amazing. Has the story of George Whitefield and the First Great Awakening inspired you? If so, how? Yes, Judy.
Well, it didn't inspire me personally at my age, but I think it might inspire young kids because didn't it say he was a truant? It showed the school he went to. But, you know, even if you're not doing well in school at a young age or you don't like school, I mean, I wish I love history now, but I did okay in it, but I didn't like it, you know, when I was going to school. So I think that should inspire young kids to maybe,
Yes.
you know, just pursue their dream and even do what God's called them to do, even if they didn't like school and studying, you know, when they're young.
Yeah, it's a very good point. Yeah. Isn't it? It's sad to see basically the thousands of a lot of them are college kids that are out there destroying America right now in the riots that have no idea of the history. They have no idea of the statue, the stuff they ripped down and destroyed. They don't know where it came from or you know what it was all about, and it's just it's sad. But that's one phase of communism that destroy everything that's history. So looking over that Freedom Trail, was there one site that was kind of struck you more than the others? Is there anything there that... I don't know, those the churches, the South and the North Church there, just the importance of how important that church was to bring everybody together. It was just incredible. I remember even my dad talking of when he was a boy, of how they look forward to Sunday, just because that's the only time during the week that they saw their friends and saw everybody, and then learned the latest things that were happening. So the church was a whole lot more than just a church. It was it was a spiritual, but yet it was a uniting factor for where they all came together and formed. So.
I always think the cemeteries are kind of cool too. There's one in Juneau too, and it goes quite a few years back. And we were in Philadelphia a couple of years ago, and we just stumbled on a couple as we were walking along. Just these little, right off the main sidewalks, little cemeteries.
Yes.
And just we did know some of the names that were on some of those headstones, and it was just interesting that that person actually lived and is buried there. Like Paul Revere and all the other ones. Interesting history behind that too, all the cemeteries, and that person's actually there, and they lived and died and did great things. So
Yes, yeah. It's like I say, even thinking Wisconsin, 1848, Wisconsin became a state, and looking back at our cemeteries around here, and how many of those cemeteries people go back that far or before that time. So it's amazing.
The cemetery also struck me, and what it was about, it was the British soldiers used tombstones as target practice. And it kind of made me think that history repeats itself. The disrespect they had for the people there is the same kind of thing that's happening today.
Yeah, good point, Mike. Very good. On CBN, they were talking about they're having something called the Mercy Movement. October 6th, it's going to be on from 7 to 9, and it goes back to in Plymouth, Massachusetts, and it recounts the past 400 years, from 400 years ago, recognizing the importance of our colonies. So, I think it's interesting that they talked about that being the Great Awakening, going through the 1730s to 1740s. And right now we are hearing that we are on the cusp of a Great Awakening that's about to happen. And through the election coming up, that as we move into, I'll say, Trump's second term, or as we progress, there's going to be a lot of changes that are going to be made, changes to our currency, changes to just things being released, that he wants to release many things, medical, cancer cures. But above it all, they're calling this the Great Awakening that's about to happen, that is going to bring millions of people to Christ. And there was I listened to a prophecy that was made back in the 1980s by a priest in England, and he had said at that time that the Lord had showed him in a dream that he was going to be bringing a man, raising a man up in the United States, that he was a type of playboy now, that was back then, but he was going to become a man of God, and God was going to use him to bring millions of people to his word. And so at that time he didn't know who he was talking about, but as things unfolded, it became that President Trump was the guy. So, but there's been many, and it's increasing quite a bit. If you listen, there's a lot of prophetic dreams that are happening right now, and that have happened, proclaiming and they're all kind of centering in on this new movement that's about to happen. So, something called Nasara, that's about to take over. It was something President Kennedy wanted to put in before he was assassinated, and it's been revised several times. But the key to the whole thing was getting rid of the deep state, getting rid of some of the players that were in the way that Satan had put there to stop prosperity. And so those players are being removed now, and as they say, our best days are ahead of us. And so that's just a little on that. Does anyone have anything they'd like to share on either what we just saw? I kind of want to remind everyone that as long as we're talking about President Trump and things coming up, we have the Life Chain this afternoon, and it's probably the most important life chain we've had, because the election next month, whether we say it or not, pro-life is kind of on that agenda with the Supreme Court and what can all happen. So it's really important, I think, that we make a good stand and for the life chain. So if you can possibly make it, I would encourage you to make it. And one other thing. Does anybody notice anything different here this morning? The windows, yeah. It's pretty sharp. So we have them. So, any last comments? Are you enjoying this series? Yeah. Okay. Nathan.
Thank you. It struck me of Lord's of Washington, Lord Washington. It is something how he live by a ship. How he talked about Lord Washington, and how he to change things, and how he explained by Lord Washington, and how he changed things about that year. About that year, he was changing other things of why he did before, and it really amazing what he did, and seeing the battle, and he's seeing the battle, he's seeing everything, and a history of Lord's, and so yeah, it was something. So yeah.
Yes. Yeah, thank you, Nathan. Yeah, how George Washington came on the scene and turned that battle from Bunker Hill and just how America moved forward from that point on. Very good. Well, then, with that, I think we'll end this morning, and got a little bit before the service, and thank you for coming.